Welcome to another edition of the BreakPoint Podcast. I'm Shane Morris. Last month marked the 47th anniversary of the deadliest Supreme Court decision in American history, Roe v. Wade, in which a majority of the justices held that there is a constitutional right to terminate a pregnancy as part of the right to privacy. Well, it began a decades-long conflict in our culture over the moral status of the unborn, as well as how that should affect their legal status. It also saw the government-approved and sometimes government-funded killing of around 60 million children in the womb. With the confirmation of two solidly pro-life justices to the Supreme Court since Donald Trump entered the White House, however, we're looking at the real possibility of a decision that defangs or even perhaps overturns Roe, as well as subsequent pro-choice rulings. Could we see such a decision in the near future? What are the legal hurdles a case would have to clear to come before the justices? What's the ideal challenge to Roe? And how can the pro-life movement respond in a world where legal abortion may no longer be a given? Here to answer these questions and more is Clarke Forsythe, Senior Counsel to Americans United for Life, and the author of Abuse of Discretion, the Inside Story of Roe v. Wade. Mr. Forsythe has argued cases before both federal and state courts and has testified before Congress and state legislatures. He's a prolific writer on pro-life policy issues with more than 19 law review articles and book chapters, and he's been an especially helpful voice on potential ways through the legal tangle of Roe v. Wade and all the subsequent bad decisions on abortion. You've been on the front lines of the pro-life legal movement for a very long time now. Given what you have experienced in that time, what do you think the chances are with the new landscape on the Supreme Court with Justices Gorsuch and Kavanaugh that we will see a landmark abortion case within the next few years?
I think the chances are good. I think they're the best they've been since Roe v. Wade in 1973. But there's no guarantee because there are substantial hurdles, and you've got to know that abortion advocates, and they're supported by many billion-dollar foundations and one major political party and numerous activist groups and numerous billionaire funders across the country are fighting 24/7 to see that it never happens, just as we are fighting to push over Roe v. Wade, they are fighting to prop it up. And they will never give up until a majority on the Supreme Court actually issues a decision, and then even then they will be fighting in Congress and in the states to preserve a right to abortion. So it's going to be a ferocious fight in the next couple or several years, but I do think there are a number of things working in our favor.
Well, that's a perfect segue into what I think is the main issue we want to deal with right now, and that's the legal state of the pro-life movement in America. What's our outlook? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it in between? What can we expect in the coming years?
Well, I take what I call a prudential approach to public policy, to protecting human life and American law. And I explain this at great length in my 2009 book, Politics for the Greatest Good, The Case for Prudence in the Public Square. And that means, prudence means practical wisdom, attempting to secure the moral good in politics, moral goods in American law. And prudence is a biblical virtue, as we know. Joseph, Nehemiah, Esther, Daniel all exhibited great prudence as exiles who held political power in pagan regimes. And, they should be kind of our models. And that means that we have to take very simply, we need to take account of and really understand, really discern our opportunities and our obstacles. So when I look at what's going on in the states, first of all, I think we need to take account of the progress that we've made over the last 30 years. Look at all the legislation that's been passed by the states. Look at the number of state legislatures that are pro-life. Back in the 70s or 80s, there might have been 6-8 states with pro-life majorities. Today, there are 25 to 30 states with pro-life majorities. Look at the members of Congress. Back in the 70s, there were many fewer members of Congress who were staunchly pro-life. Just 2 weeks ago, January 2nd, Americans United for Life filed a brief on behalf of 207 members of the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House on a brief in the Supreme Court in the current pending abortion case, the most members of the House and Senate to join a pro-life brief in the Supreme Court ever, asking the court to reconsider Roe versus Wade. So these are tangible signs of momentum that have shown our progress.
You mentioned a case that's coming before the court shortly now. Could you describe that for our audience? Tell us a little bit about what's going on. That's
the case from Louisiana. It's called Gee versus June Medical Services, the abortion clinic in Louisiana. Louisiana is defending its law that requires that abortion providers be able to transfer women in an emergency who have suffered complications after an abortion to a hospital within 30 miles of their clinic and have credentials to admit patients to emergency rooms in hospitals. Doctors call it admitting privileges. But it means, are they going to be able to quickly and smoothly transfer the woman's medical record and the medical information and data about what her condition is so that she can be taken care of? So it's a very important case involving health and safety. And it shows that the pro-life movement is and has long always been on the side of women, because abortion's bad for both. This is not just kind of a do-over of the 2016 case from Texas, where the court struck down an admitting privilege law and clinic regulations from Texas. Louisiana has a better record, I think, better facts, better trial, and it's going to be argued on March 4th by the pro-life Solicitor General of Louisiana, Liz Murrill. Maybe only the second time in 47 years that a pro-life woman has argued an abortion case before the U.S. Supreme Court. So it's going to be an important case with a decision by end of June, and it will really show us in a concrete way where this new majority is on the Supreme Court and whether they are poised to take tiny steps, small steps, or big steps in deferring abortion policy to the states, cutting back on Roe versus Wade. We'll have to wait and see.
So if the court hands Louisiana a victory in that case, what are the implications there?
Well, I think people have asked me, and the big question has been whether the court's going to overturn Roe versus Wade in this case. I think that it won't happen, definitely. I think there's almost no chance of that happening for a number of reasons. But what I'm going to be looking for is this the first of a series of cases that can take us toward an ultimate showdown that overturns Roe versus Wade. And that's what we're looking for. We're not just looking for the court to continue to hold the abortion issue, but to give more deference to the states. Roe versus Wade is an evil decision. It declared a private right to kill the innocent children. And abortion's bad for women and children. And the court has got to decentralize the issue, loosen its control over the abortion issue, and return it to the American people and get out of what Justice Scalia called the abortion umpiring business.
Well, you mentioned it being evil and immoral, but not only that, in your book, Abuse of Discretion, you describe Roe versus Wade as creating a prolonged public turmoil. Why was that? What was it about that particular case that set the culture itself on fire? And what is the abuse of discretion you're referring to in the title?
Well, I think it's a series of elements or factors. One is that the decision was just extreme by international standards. The court didn't create a tiny right to abortion. They didn't create a limited right to abortion. They didn't create a right to abortion in the first 12 weeks. They legalized abortion for any reason at any time in all 50 states. Abortion virtually on demand from conception to birth. And that sets out the U.S. as one of only 4 nations of 195 across the globe that allows abortion for any reason after fetal viability. Not done by state representatives or members of Congress, not approved by the American people in an election or a ballot initiative, not approved by Congress or elected representatives. It was dictated by the court. And the court didn't have any evidentiary record, didn't have a factual record about abortion or its implications. It was very manipulated behind the scenes. A few of them made a decision and then had a struggle with, how are we going to explain this? How are we going to write this? How are we going to justify this? And they've never come up with a coherent reason to justify it. And it's created turmoil within the courts, confusion within the courts, and it's inflamed public opinion because the public has never supported the extreme nature of Roe versus Wade.
Well, as I understand it, the United States is actually in the company of a very small and sort of sordid group of nations that are this slack on abortion. Is that right?
Exactly. We're one of 4 nations that allows abortion for any reason after fetal viability. So we are grouped with North Korea, China, and Canada. Those 4.
That's terrible company to be in.
It is terrible company. And to some extent, Canada is like the U.S. I mean, North Korea and China are very different, of course. But Canada is like the U.S. in that they had a court decision that struck down their law, and then the country's never done anything, Parliament's never done anything in Canada to fill the vacuum or try to overturn the decision. But the U.S. is different, and this is another sign of progress. When you look at countries with parliamentary systems like Great Britain and Canada, in which the Parliament has created a right to abortion, or the court has, parliamentary systems have weak pro-life movements. But the U.S. has a federalist system. We've got, one federal government, but we've got 50 state governments. And if we're stymied in Congress, we can go to the states to enact laws to protect life. And the states are the strength, or one of the great strengths of the pro-life movement in the United States. And I think because of our federalist system, we have a vibrant pro-life movement that is much more vibrant than the pro-life movement in Great Britain or Canada.
Well, let's say the best case scenario takes place. The Supreme Court signals in a variety of smaller cases that it's going to be solidly pro-life, and then a challenge reaches the court which prompts them to overturn or significantly roll back the ruling in Roe versus Wade. At that point, given our federalist system and the fact that the states are the laboratories of democracy, what happens next? Is abortion now illegal? Is it the wild, wild west? What occurs?
Well, I think there's what does it mean for the court to overturn Roe versus Wade or overrule Roe versus Wade? I think there's a lot of misinformation out in the public. It doesn't mean that the court makes abortion illegal. It doesn't mean that one national law goes back into effect that makes abortion illegal. It doesn't mean that 50 state prohibitions go back into effect. It basically means that the law is sent back to the states, and what's ever on the books in the states could conceivably go back into effect. So if Tennessee has a 20-week limit, they can probably enforce that. If they have parental notice and consent laws, they can probably enforce that. If Alabama has a prohibition from conception, they may well be able to enforce that. So whatever on the books goes into effect. So to some extent, it means that there'll be very little immediate short-term change, but it means that the issue's there for the state legislatures and the governors to act, supported by public opinion in the states. I look back at what happened in the 2019 legislative sessions. You had, for lack of a better term, blue states going in a radical pro-abortion direction like New York and Illinois, but you had a lot of so-called red states going in a pro-life direction, passing strong limits on abortion, including prohibitions even in the first trimester. I think that's what the post-Roe environment is going to look like until things settle out over 1 or 2 or 3 legislative sessions and electoral cycles. But I think that what it means is that over the course of a year or 2 or 3, we'll have a more pro-life public policy than we do now, because the federal courts won't be throwing out the laws that the states pass.
Right. Roe versus Wade is more like a roadblock in the way of these state-level laws, not so much a national mandate.
That's exactly right. And I mean, California and New York and Washington State and Illinois are going to be pro-abortion terrain until, political change happens and the people elect different representatives. But the Midwest, from North Dakota down to Texas and across the Southwest and the Southeast, there are a lot of states, a lot of pro-life states with pro-life majorities, and they're going to be able to both pass and enforce limits on abortion.
Well, that raises another interesting possibility, Clarke. We're going to be covering so-called abortion sanctuary cities on BreakPoint in a few days. And there's an article coming out actually in the California Legal Review detailing how local prosecutors could essentially, in these urban areas, could essentially refuse to enforce any federal or state laws against abortion. And that's modeled after the sanctuary cities that have gone into place with the immigration issue. What's the best response in a scenario like that, where Roe versus Wade is no longer preventing pro-life laws from going into place, but there are simply, recalcitrant local officials who say, well, we're too pro-choice to enforce these laws?
Well, it's going to set up, I think, both a legal and legislative and political fight. I mean, you'd have to take the urban areas one by one. I mean, in a state like California, there's not going to be any change. LA and San Francisco can do what they want, and the state legislature in Sacramento is not going to do anything to limit them. Same thing in Chicago. In Illinois, the state legislature and the governor is not going to do anything to prevent Chicago from being a Planned Parenthood, sanctuary. But you'll have other states in which there may be a city that is maybe more quote-unquote liberal than the rest of the state, say Tulsa and Oklahoma. There might be an attempt in Tulsa or Oklahoma City to create a quote-unquote sanctuary city for abortion, but the legislature could pass laws that could prevent the capitals from being a sanctuary city. But then are you going to get local DAs to, enforce the laws in the cities? So there needs to be, pro-life forces are going to have a new era, in a sense, of being concerned about law enforcement.
Do you think more modern methods of abortion, like the chemical abortions, the so-called do-it-yourself method, change that picture in any way?
They will be new challenges, certainly, I think. But, we should understand, too, and I think we should be talking about these issues now, that, chemical abortifacients aren't safe. They can be have a terrible, life-threatening impact on women. And, mail-order abortion by mail order is a terrible idea. There have been a number of instances in which, women have gotten drugs through the mail and hemorrhaged severely, or they've had an abortion at home, delivered a child alive, thrown the child in the dumpster behind the restaurant. All kinds of, terrible scenarios have happened, and that's why, the pro-life movement has to be on the side of women and has to be educating women that abortion's not good for them. We're just talking now about immediate negative consequences. What about the long-term consequences? The international data showing a increased risk of preterm birth after abortion and future pregnancies, an increased risk of breast cancer after abortion, the increased risk of mental trauma after abortion. These are long-term risks that have been documented by numerous international studies of women in 30 different countries. And we need to be educating about this data more and educating women about the data and helping America to understand that abortion is bad for both. And the sanctuary city problem and the enforcement of the law problem is ultimately a political problem. And are pro-life people going to be effective in enacting pro-life public officials who will enforce the law?
Now, we're to some extent, of course, counting our chickens before they're hatched here. Roe versus Wade is not overturned, and we don't know the scenario yet in which that could take place, although we can speculate. Less than 2 years ago, Clarke, you actually drafted an opinion overturning Roe versus Wade, sort of a sample opinion on what that would potentially look like. And it was published in the Georgetown Journal of Law and Public Policy. And in it, you tried to include a wide body of legal criticism of Roe versus Wade in the last almost half century now. Tell us a little bit about that draft and what insights and potentially avenues it offers for overturning this bad ruling.
Well, at the time I started it, it was before the 2016 election. And I started writing it actually at a time when most legal commentators and legal scholars would have thought that it was fantastic, that the idea that the Supreme Court might overturn Roe versus Wade was, fantastic. A
pipe dream.
Yeah, a pipe dream. But after the 2016 election, it got to be more of a realistic possibility. And I think a lot more legal scholars and legal commentators think the chances are much greater since the 2016 election, and of course with the additions of Justice Gorsuch and Justice Kavanaugh. But I wrote that because it had never been done before, and I wanted to basically sketch a draft of a realistic way in which this Supreme Court might do it. So I explain why Roe is radically unsettled 47 years later, why it was wrongly decided as a matter of law and constitutional law, why it has been completely unworkable. The factual changes that in 47 years, like ultrasound, the introduction of ultrasound on the commercial medical market, that have changed public understanding of abortion. The legal changes that have undermined Roe, such as 30 states now have fetal homicide laws that begin legal protection from conception. So, for example, in Minnesota, they have a fetal homicide law that starts from conception. And back in the 80s, after it was enacted, when a woman was killed by her estranged boyfriend, the coroner found that she was 28 days pregnant. And they prosecuted him for a double homicide, and it was upheld. So legal changes have happened. And then finally, although abortion advocates want to contend that women have come to rely upon abortion for equal opportunity in American society, I suggest that that's not accurate. And in fact, that we see trends just in the last couple of several years that if men and women rely on anything in the United States, it's contraception, not abortion. Because over the last 20 years, the abortion rate has plummeted, and the female unemployment rate has also declined to its lowest level in 20 years. At the same time, I'm not talking cause and effect. I'm just saying these trends have coexisted over the last 20, 25 years. The abortion rate has plummeted, and the female unemployment rate has declined. So the notion, those two trends contradict the Supreme Court's claim that women need abortion for equal opportunity in American society.
Right, it can't be cause and effect given the way the numbers are going. And by the way, we will link to that opinion in our show notes for those who want to check it out. Folks, I hope you're enjoying my interview with Clarke Forsythe about the future of Roe versus Wade and the abortion debate. I just wanted to let you know that there's still time to register for our Colson Center short course, Preparing for the 2020 Election, which begins tomorrow night, February 4th at 8 p.m. Eastern. Tomorrow night's topic will be Politics and the Bible with Professor Wayne Grudem. This short course will run 4 consecutive Tuesdays, and if you miss a session, don't worry, we'll be recording all of them for you. Just come to breakpoint.org for more details and to sign up. You mentioned a moment ago the limits of the legal progress on abortion, that there's cultural work to be done. In other words, do you think there needs to be, or rather, what do you think needs to come from the culture? Where are the limits? At what point can we say, okay, the courts have delivered all they can possibly deliver, now the work outside the court begins?
Well, I think the pro-life movement has been doing a lot of good work over the last 45 years. The national networks of pregnancy care centers has grown considerably, providing direct services to women both before and after birth. All of that is crucial. That kind of a network didn't exist in the 50s and 60s. And you wonder, if it did, whether the court would have taken the route it did in Roe versus Wade. Back in 1973, there were some studies, but there wasn't the data we have today on the negative impact of abortion on women and the risks to women, short-term and long-term. There's just more data and understanding about abortion and its impact on women. People are more mobilized today than they were back in the 1960s. So a lot of good things have been happening, and certainly we need to continue them. And the need for that is going to be all the more important after Roe versus Wade is overturned, because there will be women in states with abortion limits who want an abortion and are, may travel across state lines, may try a do-it-yourself abortion. So we have to be working on all these issues now. I'm glad you're addressing the sanctuary cities issue, because we can't wait until after Roe versus Wade to confront these issues. We need to anticipate them and address them now. Another thing that we haven't addressed yet is elections. The election outcomes will undoubtedly influence the Supreme Court. I mean, first of all, elections directly influence the court, because the outcome of the presidential election means who nominates and who appoints. And the U.S. Senate is important because the Senate confirms or rejects judges. So the presidential election and the Senate elections directly impact the evolution of the court. But there's also, I think, just an indirect effect on the court. If the court adds 2 new justices, but then someone's elected president who is radically pro-abortion and wants to nominate justices who are radically pro-abortion, that kind of sends a signal that the country might, not support a decision sending the issue back to the states. So I think it would only encourage the justices if elections are victories are such, electoral outcomes are such that show the court that the country is going to support it when the issue is sent back to the states. So elections are important as well.
And the courts do pay attention to them. It's not necessarily a referendum, but they definitely have their ears to the ground when it comes to public opinion.
Definitely.
They say that the best way to, defeat your opponent is to understand how they think. And you mentioned elections as something that could potentially go wrong in the coming days. What are the other main dangers moving forward, you think? In what way could the pro-choice movement sort of rally and turn this thing around and further entrench abortion?
Well, the one that comes to mind is obviously elections, but I think otherwise it's establishing, to some extent, what you might call sanctuary states. I mean, Planned Parenthood isn't sitting on its hands. They have a post-Roe strategy. And their post-Roe strategy at least consists of a West Coast sanctuary in California and Washington State, a Midwest sanctuary in Chicago and Illinois, and a East Coast sanctuary in New York City, New Jersey, and the Northeast. So they have their own post-Roe strategy. And we have to be working state by state across the board. We need to be increasing legal protection for the unborn child in abortion laws, but also outside abortion laws, outside the context of abortion, fetal homicide laws, wrongful death laws, in tort and criminal law, prenatal injury laws, all of that. So we need to be working in the legislatures. We need to be showing force and support in the state capitals, lobbying, be there and show up and have a presence. We need to be actively working, obviously, in elections. We need to be supporting pregnancy care centers in every town across the country. Churches need to be partnering. Every church needs to partner with a pregnancy care center and support it. Educating, the flock about the need for direct services for women, helping women before and after birth. We need to be continuing to drive down the abortion rate as a cultural issue, as a sign that abortion is not being relied upon. All of these things we need to continue doing as much as we humanly can.
So imagine you're the counsel arguing a challenge to Roe before the Supreme Court in a couple of years. What question from the justices are you most leery of? What do you think the strongest pushback from the pro-choice direction is that potential challengers should be ready for?
Well, I think it's the claim of how good abortion's been for women, the claim that abortion is necessary for women's equal opportunity, the claim that women's career aspirations and educational aspirations will be disrupted if they don't have access to abortion. I think that's where the debate is in America right now. I mean, obviously not everyone shares the concern, but, we've really won the battle We've won the debate on the humanity of the unborn child. We've largely won that in public debate and in the law. But the issue that's going to be pushed both in legislatures now, in public debate, in the media, in the courts, is going to be women have to have abortion for career success. Women need abortion to be successful. Otherwise, their education plans are going to be disrupted. Their career plans are going to be disrupted.
And it's going to be a Margaret Atwood novel. They're going to be marching around in red robes and white bonnets.
Absolutely. And, that can only be refuted by data and by, women advocates, pro-life advocates coming forward and making the case, by just, living life in our towns and communities across the country, by reaching out with direct services to women, and by showing that, in fact, again, the abortion rate has plummeted over the last 25 years at the same time that the female unemployment rate has declined. So it defies the notion that those two trends rebut the notion that abortion is necessary for women's success.
So if one of our audience members has a pro-choice friend or relative, and they get the chance to sort of make the case from a moral and legal standpoint, in layman's terms, how would you respond to someone who thought what you just said, that abortion is necessary for the advancement and equal rights of women?
We need to make the case that abortion's bad for both. And we do that, I think, with practical help, and we do it by showing that women don't have to be alone. They don't have to struggle through an unplanned pregnancy. It's best to avoid one, but if a woman has one, there will be people to come alongside her and help her, who will be there through thick and thin. And those resources are available, and that abortion's an option that has short-term and long-term consequences. It'll be with her the rest of her life. I mean, I remember Patricia O'Neill. Patricia O'Neill was an actress back in the 50s and 60s, and she got pregnant by Gary Cooper, a prominent actor in the 50s and 60s. And she wrote...
I wasn't around then.
She wrote in her memoir that the one thing in her life that she regrets the most is aborting that child. She says that she recounted the many times that she had awakened in the middle of the night crying, and that if there was one thing in her life she would do over, that it would be to have that child. Wow.
And that regret is something that's, real and pervasive and life-changing, despite what recent studies claiming the contrary, which I think have a great number of flaws.
They do. That data, those studies are flawed. They're often produced by abortion advocates. But, Patricia O'Neill's not the only one. There was an author of a book recently about the 60s and the women's movement in the 60s and 70s who had an abortion in the 70s and said, that abortion festered on me for 30 years. And so when the pro-life movement tries to dissuade women from abortion and enacts legal limits on abortion, it is on the side of women. It is on the side of helping them choose a better option and avoid the terrible, permanent, irreversible choice of abortion.
And the idea that the pro-life movement is out to hamper women's rights is a vicious lie.
Absolutely. And, look at the women who head most of the pro-life organizations in this country today. The major pro-life organizations have women presidents. My boss, our president, Americans United for Life, Catherine Glenn Foster, is an attorney, a litigator who's been president of AUL for about 3 years now, has done a wonderful job, and she's one of a series of women that are heading up political pro-life organizations, legal pro-life organizations, pregnancy care center organizations across the pro-life movement.
Clarke, how can our listeners find out more about your work?
Well, go to our website at Americans United for Life, AUL.org, and my book, Abuse of Discretion, The Inside Story of Roe versus Wade, is available. The easiest and quickest and fastest and cheapest is Amazon. But that's a particularly important book now that the whole question of Roe versus Wade is so much in the public debate today, because abuse of discretion tells how the court went off the rails in Roe versus Wade, how they were manipulating the decision behind the scenes. They were short-changing procedural requirements. They didn't have any evidence or facts about abortion or its implications. And they decided to sweep away the abortion laws and then had to fabricate a reason why. And the seeds of the reason why Roe is radically unsettled 47 years later is in that original decision in Roe and the deliberations behind the scenes.
Well, folks, check out Clarke Forsythe's work at Americans United for Life, as well as his books, all of which you can find linked in our show notes at breakpoint.org. Clarke, it's been a real pleasure having you on the show today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Shane. God bless you.
God bless you. Thanks for listening to the BreakPoint Podcast. And remember, just come to breakpoint.org to sign up for our short course preparing for the 2020 election. It starts tomorrow night. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris.